I'm here at the Themes Conference 2017 with Mehl-Madrona, who is, he wears many, many hats, and he's given us a keynote this morning on, I guess, Indigenous, the intersection of Indigenous cultures and Western medicine, something called two-eyed seeing. So, Lewis, could you tell us a little bit about what two-eyed seeing is?
It's two-eyed seeing is a term that was coined by Albert Marshall at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia, Canada. And it's the idea of being able to look with multiple perspectives. So to look from the Indigenous perspective and to look from the contemporary scientific perspective. And at Cape Breton, they're using it mostly for ecology and for studying sustainability and survival. But other people are taking it into healthcare, and that's really what I'm talking about, is to look from two perspectives at mental health care, because one-eyed vision doesn't seem to be working. We don't seem to be making much headway with mental health in the world. It seems like we're pedaling backwards. People are getting more anxious. Of course, with the world situation, maybe that's understandable. But we need more perspectives in order to really address mental illness, I think. So the Indigenous is an important perspective.
And what are some of the elements of that Indigenous perspective? What is different about it?
Well, I think the main difference is the emphasis on story and on people's story and on the way that we become who we are through the stories that we're told and the stories that we enact and that we put forth back into the world. And that more importantly than diagnosing someone with a condition is to hear the stories that got them to the place where they are and to figure out how to give them new stories to get them to a better place that they would prefer. And so that's really Indigenous vision, is looking at the process, looking at where someone came from, how they got there, and where they could go. More narrative, whereas the contemporary mental health is more about diagnosing and giving people a drug. And well, maybe it works a bit short term. It doesn't seem to have really great long-term results, at least as far as I can tell.
And what are some of the Indigenous understandings of, mental health or mental ill health?
Well, we did some studies where we talked to a lot of elders to find out what they thought. And one of the main ideas is that people just grew up with stories that were inadequate for managing their lives and their situations. And of course they talked about trauma. When people experience abuse or war or other difficulties, it affects them. It gives them a story about the world that it's not safe. And that makes a huge difference. And they talk about intergenerational trauma. And we know, of course, from biology now, we know that we inherit the life experiences of our parents in changes that are made to the genome that are passed on to us. So if our parents had trauma, then we get it. And that can be confusing because you can feel like you've been traumatized and you weren't. But it's because your parents were and you inherited their sort of proclivities to react to things. And of course, they talked about sometimes people are in the wrong place at the wrong time and they pick up an evil spirit. I wouldn't want to be in Washington, D.C. right now. You might pick up an evil spirit. But, they believe that that some people are cursed, and they have remedies for curses. But also that some people are thrown into impossible situations where there's no right answer, and that can make a person crazy. So to be in a situation where you're wrong no matter what, and to be humiliated for being wrong and shamed will make you crazy. And they were very aware of that. So those were some of the things they told us about why people one other thing is being alone makes people crazy. So so they believed that to be healthy, you have to be embedded in the community. You have to have lots of relationships and relatives around you. And so many people in the modern world are very alone, very isolated. Which, when you think about it, like a place like Sydney, I look around and there's so many people. And yet, probably most of them are relatively isolated in modern life. We don't cultivate relationships and friendships and family. So, so they talked about the, isolation being a factor even on its own for making people unwell.
And how are these two eyes, I suppose, the Western and the Indigenous, how are they intersecting? You touched on that a bit in your talk.
Well, I did. I talked about places where they're actually working, Anishinaabe Health in Toronto and Anishinaabe Muskiki in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And in these places, the one can have traditional healing, one can have medication, one can have conventional psychotherapy, one can have elder psychotherapy, go to ceremony. They have, it's amazing, they have a revitalization lodge in the middle of downtown Toronto, which is just unbelievable. They have this huge oven where they heat the rocks, for the ceremony. And in the back of their facility, in a little yard in the back of their facility, and I was just, wow, what you can do if you put your mind to it in an urban environment. So people can craft a program for themselves using traditional culture, using conventional medicine or psychotherapy, and blend, do what combination of things works well for them. And I think that's rare, but it's lovely to see that it exists somewhere. And in our work in Maine, we're trying to create more of that sort of possibility for people. We work with a group called Wabanaki Health and Wellness, and we're going in that direction, but it's harder going in the United States because we have more money in Canada. We spend too much on war and bombs and stuff, so it's a little harder.
And how did you yourself come into this work? You took us a little bit through your personal story this morning.
Well, I was born into a Cherokee family and didn't really appreciate the richness of my childhood until I got to medical school and realized that I'd had a totally different experience from most of my classmates. An experience in which we just it was normal to hear from spirits and ancestors and talk to trees and dogs and go to ceremony and sing and pray and offer tobacco and smudge and do these things that I thought everyone did. And so in medical school it was a shock, and I quickly found elders to help me stay well, and continued to explore the wisdom of indigenous cultures in North America from that moment on. So wherever I went, I connected with elders and went to ceremony and got, watched what they were doing, learned from them. I learned in Tucson and also in San Francisco area, I learned to do Cherokee bodywork, which is the foundation of American osteopathy. And I learned how to lead the revitalization ceremony, and I learned, how to handle the sacred pipe, the chanupa. So I just picked up these things over the years, just hanging out, as people do, with elders. And had the opportunity to publish some papers and write some qualitative studies about what elders think and what they do, and We actually even did some numerical studies of people who one of them was a study of exceptional survivors from cancer who work with Aboriginal elders. And we looked at people who were predicted by a panel of oncologists to have less than 10% survival at 5 years out. And they were, well, more than 5 years, and interviewed them and got their records and so documented that they had recovered from their cancer and talked to elders about, well, what did you do with them? What do you think worked? And so that was an interesting study. I guess it was still qualitative, but there were 43 of them, so it seemed numerical. So I've published some things about what elders do and some sense of their outcomes. Though, it's hard for the evidence-based medicine people. It doesn't impress them because it's not randomized, right? Like people look for elders, or they're part of the culture. So it's not randomized, so therefore it's not good science. And there's no control group. So the idea that a panel of oncologists predicted all these people to be dead doesn't impress evidence-based medicine people. They need to have a control group. And the people, it's so funny when you think about how you would design a study that would impress them, because the control group would have to not know that they weren't seeing an elder. So how you would pull that off, I don't know.
So given those kind of conflicts, I mean, how do you see these two worlds intersecting in future or informing each other?
Well, one of the things that's emerging in actual conventional medicine is an understanding. It's slowly emerging, but this understanding that randomized controlled trials may not be the only way to figure things out. And there's a group at the University of Washington in Seattle that created a term called the Lake Wobegon effect. And they use that term because it comes from Garrison Keillor's work. He created this mythical place in Minnesota called Lake Wobegon. And in Lake Wobegon, everyone is more handsome, more smart, and just better off than other people. And it turns out that it's so expensive and so hard to do a randomized controlled trial that the results only benefit 20% of people who have the condition that's being studied. And the other 80% get the side effects and are made worse by the treatment. And yet what we do is, as the result of a randomized controlled trial, is to treat everybody with a particular condition. And so these people in Seattle are arguing that we're making more people worse than we're actually helping people, because we're treating 100% when actually only 20% would realize the benefit. And so there's actually some push to do sort of practice-based studies to see how do people actually get better. Like what actually makes people better. And we don't really know, because these randomized controlled trials usually they have to focus the rules of randomized controlled trials, or they have to focus on one outcome. And so for instance, the cardiologists want to drive everyone's cholesterol to 0. But if you get below 100, your brain starts to malfunction. But they don't care, because they don't treat brains. And one of them the other day, we were talking about a class of drug called beta blockers, with the residents, the physicians in training that I work with. And he said, well, there's 3 beta blockers that are evidence-based. There's metoprolol tartrate, there's corvedolol, and he named one other one. And he said, but I only prescribe metoprolol. And I turned to him and I said, but metoprolol messes up your glucose, and corvedolol has a better effect. It's neutral for blood glucose. And he said, I don't treat blood glucose. I only treat hearts. I don't care about diabetes. So I looked at the residents and I said, that's why we're in general practice, because we actually care about the whole person and not just the heart. So that sort of understanding is starting to percolate a little bit in medicine. So I'm of hope that we can be a little less arrogant and begin to see that there's other perspectives besides this narrow evidence-based, which privileges certain kinds of evidence and dismisses other kinds of evidence.
And what role does stories have to play in this?
Well, I think when we're talking about mental health recovery, that narrative methods are probably more revealing than statistical methods. So narrative inquiry is a methodology, qualitative methodology, in which one collects the stories of people who recovered and looks for similarities and differences in the stories and tries to understand so what goes into recovery and how does that work? And are there common elements, or is it totally individual? You know, is there something we can learn from the stories people tell us about recovery, which you can't get from a statistical paper? You know, I mean, the typical statistical paper, one of the ones that I always talk about is a study that was done on bipolar depression. It was a study of a drug called ketiapine, and it was the study that was used to get it approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. So it took them. It was done at 43 academic medical schools, and it took them 2 years to recruit a little over 200 patients. And the reason it took so long in so many medical schools was because they were looking for people who'd never thought of suicide, who'd never misused a substance, who'd never been hospitalized, who hadn't had any previous psychotherapy, who hadn't had really anything, who had no other illnesses. And I tell the students, I don't have any patients like that. No wonder it took them so long in so many academic centers, but I could treat that group of patients with anything. I could do Reiki and they would get better, you know. And yet this is the group of patients that constituted best category evidence for this drug. And I'm like, that doesn't tell me what it's going to do for my patients who are all thinking of suicide and have been hospitalized and, you know, have 3 other illnesses, and it doesn't help me. But that's the politics of medicine, you know, and I think it will change. I think that we will start paying more attention to story. I hope. I mean, because we're certainly not learning a lot about how to make people better with these drug trials that keep happening, and nobody seems to be getting better.
I mean, in fact, you talked about stories being and culture being medicine this morning and actually having physiological effects. Could you share that a little bit?
Right. I showed a study of people listening to stories about other people who were like them lowering their blood pressure, and it lowered their blood pressure without giving them a drug. Their blood pressure got lower and stayed lower over a period of time. And so stories are medicine. We change as the result of stories. There's studies about asthma improving. There's studies about rheumatoid arthritis improving. So you know, there's evidence, you know, studies starting to accumulate about the beneficial effect of hearing stories. And we know, you know, the health promotions people are all over this. They know that the way to get people to take care of their health is to tell good stories. And so the health promotions literature is full of narrative research on how to tell a good story to get someone to take better care of their health.
Seems like Indigenous people were, you know, many, many thousands of years ahead of the game on that.
Yes, indeed.
Explains why they survived so long.
Right. They didn't have randomized control trials. Had they might have, you know, disappeared.
Yeah, that's right.
They would have used the wrong drug.
Thank you so much for your time, Lewis.
Thank you.